Welcome back to A Brief History of Opera. My name's John Andrews and I'm here to keep your appetite for all things operatic whetted during this lockdown period. The last episode took us from opera's birth through to the end of the 17th century. This week we follow it into the 18th. We've seen how opera's first century was dominated by its spread through Italy and this ongoing tension between its two parents. On the one hand, the courtly masques of France and England, full of spectacle, dance and choruses. And on the other hand, this noble-minded attempt by a circle of Florentine scholars to recreate the perfect drama of classical theatre. And as we left off, the new art form had conquered Italy and begun its gradual migration across Europe. In the first half of the 18th century then, this tree begins to branch in so many different directions that it becomes harder and harder to keep track of absolutely everything. But the paradox is that because of the success of opera's diffusion and the greater movement and communication across Europe for scholars, aristocrats and artists alike, a fairly common musical style very quickly begins to settle down, so we have a single lingua franca across the Italian and German-speaking countries. In trying to keep a broad overview then, it is possible to identify four main strands of opera's development throughout Europe across this period. Firstly, the spread of the Venetian and Neapolitan traditions, which go from the Italian peninsula through to Germany and across to England, ever more focused on singers and very much focused in this period on the da capo aria. Secondly, in France, the development of an entirely separate, highly conservative tradition. Thirdly, the application of Enlightenment ideas and ideals to opera's librettos by Pietro Metastasio. And finally, an entirely self-conscious reform of opera's musical and dramatic language by Christoph Willibald Gluck. In Italy, the traditions of the previous century continue to flourish. In Venice, the mantle of Monteverdi and Cavalli passed to Antonio Vivaldi, impresario of the Teatro San Angelo from 1714. Meanwhile, the serious-minded approach of Alessandro Scarlatti in Naples diffused throughout Europe as Italian and Italian-trained musicians spread across the continent. Sartori to Hanover, Stradella to Rome and Venice, Pallavicino to Dresden, and most influentially Stefani to Munich and Hanover. Vivaldi himself also travelled to Mantua in 1718 and on to Vienna and Prague in the 1730s, collaborating with Metastasio and Goldoni. So we can see this Italian approach spreading across almost all of Europe. This diffusion cemented the process that had begun at the end of the previous century, whereby recitative and arias became completely separated from one another. Remember that the ambitions of those early Florentines were to tell the story entirely in genuine speech rhythms, so pitch and harmony were adding intensity and emotional realism to the text. Now, this survived into the 18th century within the recitative sections of the opera. They became drier and faster moving, often with just a harpsichord and cello accompaniment. And so dry did they become that they actually became known as secco recitative.
Giunta la regia sposa, addio Griselda.
But now, to complement that, were increasingly elaborate standalone arias, songs with clear poetic and musical structures of their own. They were generally entirely separate from the plot. They were musical and emotional reflections on the action rather than actually being part of it. And by far the most common structure was the da capo aria, and the da capo aria was in 3 sections. The opening section, which we call very unimaginatively the A section, would generally express one state of mind. I love him. I want revenge. Aren't the birds beautiful? I'm going to kill myself. Some version of that. And then the B section would qualify that emotion. But he's a traitor. But maybe I don't have the courage. Whatever. And then the singer would return, da capo, to the beginning and sing the A section again, but this time with their own improvised vocal ornamentation. The dramatic justification for this was that the ornaments would illustrate and amplify the psychological journey undertaken. But in practice, they were a massive opportunity for the singer to display their musical and technical vocal skills. And so unsurprisingly, this film grew in a symbiotic relationship with the singers themselves. The drama became all about the voice, and therefore this became an age of superstar singers, and it was the age of the great castrati. Tosi, Senesino, Farinelli and Guadagni, just to name some of the most famous and immensely well-paid stars of the stage. They were creators of some of the most iconic roles of the era, and of course it took a composer of real genius and no lack of self-confidence to meet all of their demands and still create gripping drama. And at that point, a true colossus did indeed emerge to bestride the European stage. In 1710, after initial studies in his native Halle and 4 years in Italy, George Frederick Handel went absent without leave from his post in Hanover to try his luck in the cutthroat competitive environment that was Georgian London. Without a royal court theatre, London's aristocracy were desperate to get a taste of the Italian operas that they'd heard on their grand tours, and with this appetite for opera in Italian with Italian singers and Italian-trained composers, Handel was rapidly able to establish a dominance that all but destroyed the careers of his English contemporaries, in particular John Eccles and Maurice Greene, but also resulted in some of the greatest masterpieces of the operatic canon. Taking London by storm in 1711 with Rinaldo, over the next 30 years he wrote 40 operas for the London public. In 1719 a company was set up, the Royal Academy of Music, specifically to produce Italian opera with Handel as its director of music, and this resulted in a flood of towering masterpieces culminating in Julius Caesar, Rodolindo and Tamerlano. Unfortunately, then as now, producing opera, especially with the exorbitant salaries of imported Italian star singers, has proved catastrophically expensive, and in 1728 the company folded. For the next decade, Handel continued to write operas, taking the financial risks himself, but he was never able to spread the popularity of opera to the vast majority of London theatregoers. With memories of Purcell still fresh in people's minds, the idea of all-sung Italian opera remained ridiculously pretentious for most London audiences. They wanted something in their own language, and ideally they wanted rid of the exotic nonsense that was sung recitative. Handel was able to adapt himself to their taste and produce something far cheaper with unstaged oratorios, and that left firstly Thomas Arne and later J.C. Bach to provide London with their occasional Italianate pleasures. Although Arne followed Handel's lead in writing in English. While Handel was dominating the London stage, an artistic revolution was taking place, centred around Vienna. Poets were becoming increasingly critical of over-elaborate and implausible plots, and at the same time were becoming deeply frustrated by the arbitrary demands of star singers, and they set out to simplify and clarify opera libretti along classical lines. The most influential of these poets was Pietro Metastasio. Born just before the turn of the century, he received a thorough classical education, translating the Iliad at just 12 years old. He was fortunate enough to be adopted by the wealthy jurist Granville, who died in 1718, leaving him independently wealthy and free to pursue a career as a poet. Through his relationship with the soprano Bulgarelli, he became part of a musical circle that included the composers Hasse, Pergolesi, Scarlatti, Vinci and Leo, all of whom set his libretti. His appointment as court poet in Vienna consolidated his influence, and his plots and libretti became the backbone of serious opera for the next century. Attempting to apply a sense of classical balance and clarity, his plots typically focus on conflicting passions between a fairly small group of people. Usually set in Greco-Roman history or mythology, they generally feature two pairs of lovers, often separated by a tyrant, in a setting which allowed for scenic variety, pastoral, military, courtly. And therein are three balanced acts centering around a very specific number of da capo arias for each character. The principal characters would have the largest number of arias, and the plot was engineered so that each aria encapsulated a particular emotional state or affect. These are most perfectly embodied in the operas of his friend Hasse, who studied in Naples and went on to be Kapellmeister in Dresden before joining him in Vienna. He aimed at something clean and clear, and above all, something that reflected this monarchical idea of the perfect statesman, and it embodied the royal qualities of magnanimity, of piety, and of justice. And while the courts of Northern Europe brimmed with serious-minded plots, literally opera serie, which represented a self-consciously aristocratic and royalist worldview, back in Italy, opera was coming into contact with a rather less reverential vernacular traditions. Italian operas and plays had often had intermezzi between acts or as curtain raisers, short comic stories often featuring characters recognisable from the commedia dell'arte tradition. As this earthly and unpretentious genre met with emerging musical drama, so opera buffa was born. The first great examples of this come from the southern Italian home of opera, Naples, and the pen of Giovanni Battista Pergolesi. In a tragically short life, he wrote a number of fine serious operas, but is best known now, apart from his Stabat Mater, for La Serva Padrona, which epitomised the new comic genre with rapid, chaotic storylines and fast-paced finales.
And we see here a new range of dramatic possibilities, because unlike in the serious stage, opera buffa delighted not just in solo arias, but in duets, trios and ensembles. So for the first time, the story could actually be propelled through the musical numbers, not just the recitative.
After his death at just 26 from tuberculosis, The Neapolitan tradition was continued by the composers Niccolo Piccini and Giovanni Paisiello, with a new standard set in libretti by Carlo Goldoni. The greatest achievements of this era sadly have been eclipsed by Mozart and Rossini's later successes, but Paisiello's Barber of Seville and Cimarosa's La Matrimonio Segreto, The Secret Marriage, are both glorious musical comedies. So while this common tradition, this shared musical language and musical approach spread across most of Europe, Parisian tragédie lyrique remained essentially unchanged since the era of Lully, who had died all the way back in 1687. It was preserved in aspic by lavish state sponsorship and a highly dirigiste royal court. Into this incredibly conservative world stepped a complete outsider. Jean-Philippe Rameau was a man who lived entirely outside the world of the court for most of his life, and so he developed an entirely individual musical language. He didn't compose his first opera until he was 50 in 1733, and his reputation as a musical revolutionary was only heightened by a close and fruitful collaboration with the famous atheist and freethinker Voltaire. We know now his serious operas, in particular Castor and Pollux and Dardanus, they are totally unlike those of his contemporaries. But even the erstwhile radical Rameau looked like an arch-conservative when, in 1752, a visiting Italian company presented Pergolesi's Se va Padrona. In what became known as the Battle of the Comedians, a whole host of younger composers, including Jean-Jacques Rousseau, of noble savage fame, gathered around the new work, and Rousseau used it as a direct model for his comic opera Le Devin du Village in 1752. With hindsight, we can see the birth of opera comique in France, but we can also see that in the older tradition, in this grandiose approach to opera in Paris, the beginnings of what would become grand opera in the following century. Now, while that controversy was burning itself out in Paris, in Vienna, a much more serious-minded attempt at reforming opera was underway. We've seen that Metastasio had set himself the task of purging opera's texts of their extravagance and chaos, large numbers of characters, ludicrous incident. And in the second half of the 18th century, Christoph Willibald Gluck took it upon himself to effect a similar reform of the musical architecture. Born in Bohemia, educated in Italy and widely travelled throughout Europe, he became court composer in Vienna and from the 1750s became profoundly influenced by these reformist ideals. Whilst Metastasio had purged the texts of operas of their unnecessary and unbelievable incidents, it was the vocal style that concerned Gluck. Dominated by dazzling vocal displays and ornamentation in this era, it just seemed to him as artificial and unbelievable as the old plots. He wanted to return the music to the role it had held in those pristine years under the Florentine Camerata, namely as purely supporting the drama, lending emotional colour and depth to the text, and never stepping beyond what was justified within the world of the drama itself. That pull of Florence exerting itself once again. In practical terms, this meant abolishing the da capo aria with the soloist repeating the opening section. It meant finding a simplicity of vocal expression that was completely natural to the dramatic situation. It meant an increased role for ensembles, so this was a new thing, so that characters could be situated within a real social and political context, and they could interact with each other rather than simply singing a series of solo numbers. It meant that the plots had to exist in a larger human context, and this meant integrating the overture and orchestral movements into the drama itself. But what was most radical about Gluck's reforms was that he set out to collapse the distinction between secco recitative and arias. There'd always been intermediate sections, there'd always been accompanied recitative, brief moments where the orchestra accompanied speech-like declamations. What Gluck set out to do was to collapse all of these three styles into one seamless, orchestrally accompanied arioso that could carry the plot.
It's possible then to see Gluck as taking all of the best techniques available to him, these ensembles from opera buffa, large-scale choruses from oratorio, and instrumental sections, and putting them all back in the service of that pristine ideal of opera as the noble expression of the drama itself. And it's probably no accident that, like the Florentine composers, he went straight to the myth of Orpheus, and it's his Orfeo of 1762 that encapsulates these ideas so perfectly.
Now, whilst it might be said that Gluck's historical importance outstrips the quality or popularity of his own works, quite the reverse will be true of his younger colleague, and next time we will begin with the works of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart.